Can you see my screen okay? Just to confirm. Very good.
Yes, it is.
What I want to do is make a relatively succinct presentation, and then what I'm really looking forward to, in the spirit of what Francisco André said, is to dialogue and hearing what it is in what I'm presenting that you find particularly engaging. And I will begin by setting out some definitions. So what I see public diplomacy as, but I think it's very important that we emphasize the extent to which it is changing. I'll then talk about soft power and some of the changes that are happening in soft power. And particularly, I want to explore the limits of soft power, because one of the things that we see in our field right now is that soft power has come to mean many things to many people. And when a concept is so widely used, it becomes very diluted. And I think it's time to revisit the concept and look at the most important meanings to carry forward into the future. Particularly, the part that I want to emphasize is what I call reputational security. This aspect of the reputation of a country that needs to be this aspect of the security of a country that depends on its reputation. My theme, therefore, is that we're moving into a new era in international relations, and that, just hold on a second, please. Sorry about that. My theme is that there's a new era in international relations. So first of all, what is public diplomacy? Well, I would define it as an extension of diplomacy, as you know, that I see traditional diplomacy as an actor's attempt to manage the international environment through engagement with a foreign actor, and that public diplomacy is still trying to do the same thing. It's still trying to manage the international environment, but the international actor is working through a set of tools which are reaching out to a foreign public. So to give you an example, if the president of Brazil goes to China, meets president of China, they shake hands in public, but what's really important happens in private, in traditional diplomacy. But in public diplomacy, one of the strategies might be for Brazil to open a pavilion or invest in a pavilion at Expo in China to engage directly with the Chinese public. But also we could say to facilitate engagement from public to public. So absolutely, I see the Erasmus program as being one of the most important forms of public diplomacy of recent years. However, the term public diplomacy is only 50 years old, and within that term or beneath that term, we find much older practices. So I see the term as relatively new, but the practices as ancient. I have 5 practices that I see as core to public diplomacy. The first and most important component is listening, engaging the foreign public by bringing information from that public into the policy-making process. Second component, advocacy, engaging a foreign public by seeking to influence that public through press conferences, or social media campaigns, all the kinds of things we see at the moment. Third element, cultural diplomacy, reaching out to a foreign public through cultural mechanisms. The illustration at the back is Cyril, who was employed by the Byzantine emperor to take Orthodox Christianity to the Balkans, and in so doing, extended the political influence of Byzantium. And I think that often politics or political influence comes from cultural outreach. We have the example in the Cold War of the United States using popular culture, including jazz music, to engage communities around the world. Today, we have the Chinese government investing in Confucius Institutes as being an important mechanism of cultural diplomacy. My third element is exchange diplomacy, reaching out to international audiences through facilitating exchanges between your citizens and their citizens. And I see this as being a different mechanism to culture, because it's necessarily a two-way process, whereas many countries approach cultural diplomacy as a form of one-way or a display rather than a two-way exchange. I see culture as being rooted in traditional practices of exchange. That would be things like intergroup fosterage, fostering of children from one group to another, which was practiced by Celtic people, Nordic people in ancient Europe. And I think prefigures are academic exchanges, school exchanges, professional exchanges today. For me, exchanges are one of the most powerful, or maybe the most powerful mechanism we have in our public diplomacy toolbox. But as you know, they take a long time to really be effective. But just because they take a long time doesn't mean that we shouldn't invest in them. The fifth element is international broadcasting, which I see as state investment in news media, and particularly in journalism for international outreach. And I'm originally from Britain, and this is something that has been a central element in British public diplomacy. Today, again, the Chinese government is putting tremendous investment into this sector. The United States contributed an umbrella term, public diplomacy, in the 1960s. It came out of the policies and personnel involved in the Kennedy administration, though it wasn't really used until 1965. Part of the idea of creating the term public diplomacy was so that there could be a term that was benevolent and for democracies. The United States wanted to be able to say, those wicked communists do propaganda, we virtuous Democrats, democratic societies practice public diplomacy. Even though there was maybe even something cynical in the creating of the term public diplomacy, the diplomats needed the term. They needed to be able to say, we have a benevolent practice, and they filled up the empty term public diplomacy with positive meanings, carrying it forward to be a two-way process that we have today. And I believe something very different from propaganda. This is how the Canadians conceptualized public diplomacy 15 years ago now. If you look at this diagram carefully, you'll see that over on this side, you have a timeline. So short-term, long-term. Over here is level of government control. So advocacy is short-term with a strong level of government control. Cultural work comes in the middle in this profile raising. So it's medium-term, medium level of government control. But at the bottom, we have relationship building, the exchange diplomacy, which is long-term and necessarily unmediated, where governments are enabling people to get together, and then people are doing what they do best, making connections, hence Francisco André's reference to 1 million Erasmus babies, which is starting to actually make new people in Europe and create a different kind of person who will have a different kind, necessarily a different kind of politics. Public diplomacy has changed since the end of the Cold War. We have a number of things to identify. First of all, we're dealing with a new context, a post-Cold War context, where it's not just two blocks speaking to each other in the world. Maybe it never was just that, but a number of nations, of significant nations, telling their stories, listening, but also asserting. And we see this complicated game taking shape. New kinds of players. No longer, it's not just a nation state using public diplomacy tools, but international organizations, non-governmental organizations, corporations, and foundations funded by corporations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation with its work in medical outreach. Single individuals can play a role, as can terrorist organizations. So many kinds of actors. We have these amazing new methods associated with the internet. And to me, what is most important are the new directions that come out of the internet, an emphasis on the horizontal and networked nature of communication. So in the classic public diplomacy formulations, the nation would speak, everyone would listen all around the world. Today, nations are just one voice, so a nation or a national communicator introduces a concept onto a horizontal web, and it's passed from person to person to person across that network. And so its success as a message depends on its internal quality and whether somebody will actually want to pass it on. So that's very different. We have challenges that come from globalization. A country speaks overseas and it's heard at home. It's also heard overseas. So this interrelationship, the abolition, if you like, of the old division between an international audience and a domestic audience, this has brought tremendous changes. Again, to go back to China, I see, for example, the Beijing Olympics, not so much as being reaching out to international audiences, but rather showing a domestic audience the success a national government can have impressing international audiences. So if you like, it was propaganda more for domestic consumption, so that the government could show it or give its own people the gift of the admiration of the world. In former times, it was much more possible to have one message for a foreign audience, one message for a domestic audience. This would not happen now. We have a new vocabulary in public diplomacy. We've had in recent years tremendous emphasis on concepts of branding, rebranding. I think about this a lot, and also the limits on changing your logo, coming up with a beautiful logo, beautiful slogan. This isn't what makes an international image. The reason that the rebranding of Spain worked so well in the 1980s was not that they had a great logo, which they did, it was that Spain had really changed. When General Franco tried rebranding Spain in the 1960s, it didn't work because he was still who he was, a fascist, and that had to change. Spain had to be a democracy. It had to have tremendous legal and political reform before a new Spain could be introduced to Europe. I've been interested in the emergence of indices to actually try and imagine, to actually try and measure international reputation of countries and what publics think about places around the world. This thing that governments are putting so much effort into trying to change. Right now, I think the best index is Simon Anholt's Good Country, Simon Anholt's Nation Brands Index. And I'll be glad to talk about how I see these indices working later on. Right now, Germany has the strongest brand, but if the European Union was taken as a brand, when Anholt polled to see what his opinion of the European Union around the world, what he found was that if it was a country, it would have absolutely the strongest brand. It would be more respected than Germany, which was a surprise and a very, very interesting, very interesting finding. There's a new focus in public diplomacy. Today we have to work through coalitions, and there are good reasons for this. But one of them is that no one speaker is credible to all audiences or all demographics. So you have to work with as many different people as possible to bring in as many kinds of people and be successful with those networked connections. There are new sources of morality in the world. You can't just talk about what's good for one nation. You can't just talk about what's good for human beings in terms of human rights. It's now also important to talk about sustainability. And we're seeing how countries have been severely criticized internationally, and their reputations have been damaged because of damage to the natural world. And a good example has been a fall in opinion around Brazil over an international perception that forest fires have been mishandled there. Of course, all of this has led to and been concurrent with the emergence of soft power as a way of thinking about public diplomacy. And this is the contribution of Professor Joseph Nye of Harvard to public diplomacy work. Soft power has been central, but as I'm arguing, it has become diluted by many different kinds of country developing the concept in their own way. Remember, with soft power, we're not talking about, with soft power, what we are talking about is the emphasis on the emphasis of values and culture and behavior on a country's ability to operate in the international, at the international level. It's not the same as saying you can have a carrot or a stick to move a donkey, because you need to actually have a carrot to move a donkey. So that would be like spending money on the international stage, a form of hard power. Similarly, the stick is obviously hard power. Rather, it would be moving that donkey by telling the donkey a story, making the donkey interested in the values that you have, which doesn't work with donkeys. But my feeling is, why do we have models of behavior that are based on farm animals when what we're trying to do is communicate with human beings who are capable of imagining multiple futures for themselves, who are making all kinds of assessments in their daily life between past and future, between fear and hope. And it's in that space, that imaginative space, that public diplomacy works. But there are these problems with soft power. First of all, we're talking about, accurately, I think, about this attention to the force of attraction and attention to the contribution of values and culture. The problem is that the field is focused on the largest actors, that public diplomacy, that soft power is seen as relevant to the biggest actors particularly. When soft power is, sorry, could everybody mute, please? It's quite distracting to have background noise. Could you mute, please? The soft power 30, one of the attempts to measure soft power, obviously only looks at 30 countries. But when we have when we have 200 countries in the world, and we're only measuring the soft power of 30, or if only countries are sufficiently significant to be regarded as having soft power, what about the rest? Do we have soft power 30 and no power 170? I think that right there you have something of a problem. We also have a paradox within soft power, that it's all about attraction, and yet if you talk about how attractive you are as a person, that's inherently repulsive, and it works that way for countries too, that the more a country talks about how fantastic it is, sometimes the less people around the world are convinced that it really is fantastic or admirable. Remember, too much attention to developing an image is unattractive in people and unattractive in countries too. This means that the meaning of soft power has diluted. And if we look at how different countries think about it, you can see that in the United States, soft power is associated with, particularly with national wealth and with the outreach of popular culture. China thinks about the strength of its economic system as what makes it attractive, and its language, but it certainly doesn't expect to be admired for its human rights. But it does invest in publicizing its language around the world. I think that the way of getting towards a soft power that's relevant to the remaining 170 countries is to think about its defensive aspect. I see reputation as being one of the qualities that can actually help protect a country in the world. That if we imagine a country that isn't respected for anything, that's purpose in the world, that's contribution to the world is not widely known or is not clear in the minds of an international audience, that country is vulnerable. So this was one of the things that made it possible for Ukraine to lose a couple of provinces just a few years ago. The fact that the Europeans particularly didn't see Ukraine as being an incredibly valuable part of the integrity of Europe. Its borders wasn't seen as being for something particularly. The view of Ukraine people still had was that it was primarily a former Soviet republic, and individuals did not feel violated by the violation of Ukraine. There are other countries that have a stronger reputation where when their borders are violated, tremendous things happen at an international level. So I think that by developing a reputation, by engaging publics through public diplomacy, countries without power can begin to build a significance that will be give an additional level of protection. And this is what I call reputational security. And I'll be glad to talk more about that in questions. Part of the reason reputational security is important today is that we can see adversarial countries are trying to undermine reputations all the time. This includes right now a media campaign coming out of hostile countries against the Scandinavian countries, seeking to associate them with child abuse and with lax moral standards, something that I know the government of both Denmark and Norway are very worried by. But the whole problem of fake news is seeking often to undermine national reputations. We see internal confusion within countries with domestic political disputes, and I might say a measure of hypocrisy, where countries are quick to point out defects of their adversaries, but ignore their own defects and their own failings and the failings of our allies. One of the most important ways of breaking the power of fake news is not to fulfill the stereotype. If adversaries are calling you racist, it's best not to be racist. If adversaries are calling you corrupt, it's best to clamp down on corruption. Sometimes the vectors used by our enemies can give us a good clue as to things we should prioritize. But I think it's important to beware of focusing too much on the self. And one of my critiques of nation branding is that when countries in their public diplomacy talk about themselves, it makes it very hard for them to partner. So I think it's good when you talk about yourself to emphasize your capacity for partnership. And this is something that Britain has done in some places. But I think part of the problems for Britain right now is that through Brexit, it has a very uncollaborative tone in its diplomacy. I'd also like to say that as part of a shift towards reputational security, I see human rights as coming to the fore of public diplomacy issues. If you think about having a good reputation as being a way to secure your country, abusing people's human rights becomes a very bad idea. Often there are countries that say we would love to have free journalists, but we have to protect the country in the first instance. I'm saying that if you put your journalists in jail, or if you murder your journalists in consulates in other places, or if you force airplanes to land on your territory and take journalists into custody, this is damaging to your reputation. You should listen to global responses and seek to adhere to global, to universal standards and deliver the rights that are inherent to our humanity. Remember, however, that we are blind to our own biases, and so we need to listen to one another to understand where we, as individual nations, are getting things wrong. I see this as a priority right now for the United States, to listen to global support for the Black Lives Matter movement and to understand how ugly American racism and extreme American partisanship are to world opinion. I have a particular problem with monarchies which claim to have monarchs who are above the law, and I'm very concerned, especially in the Middle East, where the monarchies are not respecting standards of human rights, but still get to be allies of major powers just because they're so wealthy. And I don't think that criticism for human rights should just be for weak countries or for countries we see as our adversaries. My conclusion is that publics are central to international relations right now. So we need to have international relations strategies that include publics. Reputations matter in world affairs. They're not just an extra for the richest countries to take care of. Individual voices matter. Individuals can make a difference in international relations through public diplomacy mechanisms, speaking out and raising human rights or regional rights as issues for international audiences. Human rights matter as never before. Coalitions matter too. Our problems are too big for any one country to solve, so we need to bring people together. And that process of bringing people together is going to be a public diplomacy process. The biggest thing we need right now are the visions to animate global public opinion. Simon Anholt has said that there's only one superpower left in the world, and that superpower is public opinion. And I would absolutely agree with this. And my coda on that is, look at the trouble that is being taken to keep international opinion divided. That should be the big clue that the ultimate power rests in the people transnationally now. And that's what the dictators are so scared about. That's why they're keeping us so divided. So 21st century is going to be the century of reputational security. Public diplomacy is the tool of the 21st century. I'm so happy that MARPE Diplo is thinking about this, talking about this, and bringing people together. This is the best thing we could possibly do with our time and intellectual energy right now. For the collective benefit of our world. So thank you so much for listening. Please email me with questions, follow me on Twitter. I have a podcast right now called People, Places, Power, thinking about these issues of reputation. And I'd welcome engagement with you on all of these platforms. So that's what I wanted to say. I hope we can now go to something more like a normal conference and less like a TV show.
Thank you so much, Nick. Yes, it would be wonderful if we could be in a conference, really, but notwithstanding, your presentation was terribly good.
Terrible.
And very provocative. So we are now, we have some minutes for some questions and answers, and without monopolizing the floor, I am very curious. I have a question for you. You just was finishing saying that there is a superpower that is public opinion. And considering that we live in such a mediatized society with everyone saying what is on their mind on social media, can we say that the social media is really the floor, the arena where public opinion is gaining power, or is it just allowed minority opinions that are crumbling in these arenas? How can we know what is public opinion in such days with so many tools, so many ways to express opinion?
I think this is a really, really important question. And social media is a proxy indicator. And you have to be very careful about assuming that what Twitter says is true. That winning an election on Twitter and winning an election in a country we know are two very different things. And so for me, I always pay attention to the scientific study of public opinion. This is why I pay so much attention to Anhalt's Nation Brands Index, also to the work of the Pew Global Attitudes. So I would say, do look at social media, but include it within a mix of other indicators. And you also have to keep looking at new social media, as different platforms indicate different things and are used by different generations. Twitter, for example, probably overemphasizes journalist opinion, and you would look at other platforms to find out other stuff. But to me right now, there's no substitute for the scientific study of public opinion. And for example, Anhalt has found that Canada does particularly well right now. I don't think if you were looking at social media, you'd say, oh, look at the strength of Canada. And yet we know from the global work that Ipsos has done with Anhalt that Canadians are the most admired people. Canadian politics is the most admired, is the most admired politics. And there's another one where they come out on top. Just hold on a second. I'll just go back to my notes. I don't want to sell Canada short. It's people, governance, and as a place for investment. People say that they want to be they want to invest in Canada. Italy is the most favored the strongest tourist image, and the strongest cultural image. But Germany does so well in all these categories that Germany has the single strongest national brand. Now, none of this would figure really if you were only thinking about social media. So I believe social media is an important indicator. It's an important forum, but we shouldn't. It isn't the end of the game. Just being strong in social media isn't the answer. It isn't the reputation you're looking for.
Yes, thank you. I have Sofiano Buela also for a question, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor, for this presentation, which was very, very interesting. So I have two little questions. So in many research I did, I saw that public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy is analyzed as two different but related diplomacy. In your presentation, you are integrating cultural diplomacy as part of public diplomacy. Can you explain this kind of difference? And do you consider that the most powerful, cultural diplomacy is the most powerful tool and lever in public diplomacy? We see the language, like English language or French language with the francophonia, sorry. So thank you.
No, I think that's a good question. The reason that I include cultural diplomacy under the public diplomacy umbrella even though many cultural diplomats are upset by that, is that I see public diplomacy as being the mechanisms that a state uses to engage a foreign public. So I see it in terms of intent and in terms of budget. But I do believe that public diplomacy has to be, that the administration of cultural diplomacy has to be separate. So I favor the independence of an organization like the Goethe Institute or the British Council at arm's length. So whilst I would see culture as being a subset of public diplomacy, I feel that it has to be distant, okay? I think that cultural work and exchange work have a different quality because exchange work is necessarily two-way. And historically, culture has been, for many countries, about showing off. And and cultural diplomacy, mercifully, is now changing. So I think it's starting to move beyond some of its imperial origins to be a process of engagement in the cultural sphere. So maybe cultural work and exchange work are converging. But in some countries, you have different agencies. So in Germany, you have the DAD, the exchange agency doing the exchanges, and you have the Goethe Institute doing cultural work. So I wanted to reflect that in my components. I also see a different period of time. Exchanges work in very, very long time and an extended period, whereas the cultural work tends towards the medium period. Sofiane, does that answer the question?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Very helpful question. Thank you. I wanted to get back. Jamshid asked the question in the chat about New Zealand. And I think it's worth jumping in here to say that the image of New Zealand has improved dramatically as a result of the response to COVID. And they're one of only the two countries that have done well out of the pandemic, New Zealand and South Korea, which are but they were already on an upswing. People were learning more about them every year, liking them a little more every year. So that's continued. But New Zealanders are now, I think, in the top 5 admired governments. And they weren't there before COVID. But the present Prime Minister is much admired around the world. And I think that New Zealand has shown the way in terms of important issues in human rights, especially its respect for indigenous rights. And I think that how you treat your indigenous people for countries like New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and the United States, this is a very important, we can see right now in Chile too, that's becoming an important issue and something that will, I think, help protect the reputation of those countries going forward.
They are also benchmarking corruption and transparency index. They always get very good results on that. Yes. So now I give the floor to Zhao. Zhao.
Thank you. Hi, Nick.
Hello, nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to meet you again. I have a question about the soft power. You have mentioned that, yeah, we have some problems with regard to the soft power definition. You mentioned instead of soft power 200. So in this case, can we understand soft power is a kind of hegemony? If so, does the study of public diplomacy, especially current public diplomacy, need to refocus on a cultural imperialism approach to help us to understand what happened for this moment? Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that what you've hit on is part of the mechanism of soft power, that soft power has become like the acceptable face of cultural imperialism. And you even have countries justifying their cultural imperialism based on soft power, of saying, look, this is good for the world. So I think that by complicating the element of soft power and saying, but maybe if we frame it in terms of reputational security, you then have to say, well, okay, there should be limits on our soft power. There should be limits on our cultural outreach. That we have to be careful not to do something that is damaging. We have to be careful. We have to be respectful. And I think that some of the issues that were raised in the historical cultural imperialism debate, particularly by UNESCO in the 1970s, need to be attended to right now. But for me, I see the issue of media freedom as being especially important. And sometimes media freedom has been rather confused as an issue within soft power discussion and within cultural imperialism, where people have said, oh, but your media freedom is cultural imperialism against me. And I think that we shouldn't compromise on media freedom, but we should seek to defend it everywhere. And in work I'm doing at the moment, I'm trying to redirect attention to the connection between the promotion of media freedom and public diplomacy, to argue that money should be spent not on telling people how fantastic a particular country is, but rather on promoting particular kinds of media within all countries and defending free media. Because to me, that's an essential hedge against the instabilities that flow from the very disrupted media world we have at the moment. Does that answer the question, Zhao? Yes, good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor also to Anne-Marie Coton. She has a question for you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Cull, for your for this first keynote speech. I would like to continue on the question of Sao, because I also had a question on this dimension of soft power. You were talking about this 200, the 30 having real soft power and the 170 no power. But when you are measuring soft power, wouldn't you have to look into the real engagement of each actor with those different partners they have or they want to have, and making that kind of measurement based on these kind of relationships, instead of just looking from a world view? Because indeed you have countries which only have very, very small interactions with only some countries which are interesting for them. Thank you. That was my question.
Absolutely. And I think this is why I question the problem is that if soft power is defined in such a way that only 30 countries have it, it can't possibly be the universal feature of international relations that we know it really is. So my feeling is that that business of only soft power only being detectable in 30 countries means that we're getting it wrong, because we can't have a category. You know, I find as a historian, soft power is not just relevant in every place, but in every time too. It comes up in every time. So if it's universal in time and space, how can it be restricted to 30 countries? There's a mismatch. So whereas I feel that reputational security directs attention in the more important direction. So obviously the reputation of Mozambique is incredibly significant within its region, in how it's perceived, what it's able to do, or to give a situation right now, I think the situation in Mali has been changed by the fact that people know about Mali culture through UNESCO. Mali had a very different experience in 2012 than Afghanistan had in the 1990s, in part because people knew about the treasures in Mali and they didn't know about the treasures in Afghanistan until the Taliban had destroyed them. So I think Mali is a good example of a place that people care about, and that has had a slightly better situation internationally because of its a reputation that's more positive than for neighbor countries. So does that answer the question, Anne-Marie?
Yes, sure. Yeah. And I think we can continue afterwards on this dimension too. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. There is a last question from Selma Padano on the chat. And Selma, I don't know if you want to come live, please, and put your question.
Yes, thank you, Sonia, and congratulations for this amazing organization. Thank you for the talk. I would like to ask if there is, I didn't understand quite well, if there is no perception that sustainability includes the human right dimension, is the first question. And how this issue is addressed in the new framework indices of the country. Is it possible to build an index without this?
No, of course not. And I think that, but countries are judged by publics. And so if we want human rights to be important, we as citizens have to say human rights are important. And I think that right now it's really important that people who love a country talk about its human rights. And this is a particular problem with China, whose human rights are rightly criticized. And it's correct to say that ugly things are happening to free media in Hong Kong. And who among us would want to be a Uyghur right now? It's clear that terrible things are happening to that population. But the people who say that are people who don't know China and are on record as hating China or being rivals of China. So I think we need people who love China, people from the diaspora, even who understand Chinese culture and language, to say, but we don't like this, that China has to be better than this. Winston Churchill used to say that the great eagle will allow the small birds to sing and won't worry what they sing about, that it's part of strength to be able to tolerate diversity around you. And I think that we need to change the way we talk about human rights so that it isn't just the human rights of our enemies that we criticize, but the human rights of our friends and countries that we love. We have to say we want this country we love to do a better job. And I'm very encouraged by emphasis on good. I spend a lot of time talking to Simon Anholt. We partner in the podcast together, so we're working together at the moment. And he has moved beyond, introduced what's called the Good Country Index, not based on opinion, but based on metrics of what each country does to make the world a better place, adjusted based on the wealth of that country. And it's very interesting to see that the countries that talk the most about contributing to the world are not the countries that do most when adjusted for their wealth. The United States, for example, is in the mid-20s in the Good Country Index right now. And at some points under Trump, it slipped much further down, but it sort of stabilized in the mid-20s. Sweden does most for its wealth. Ireland does a lot for its wealth. Finland does a lot for its wealth. And Denmark, these are the countries that do most for their size in contributing to the global good around the world. And human rights is one of the categories, along with contributions to industrial innovation, contributions to climate and the security of the climate. These are also included. So I would urge you to look at a Good Country Index and the work that's happening around there on finding, encouraging the reality of good behavior, not just the image. And one of the things that really pleased me about this research was that when the objective measurement of what countries are actually doing and the measurement of international opinion were brought together, publics have done a really good job of understanding whether countries are good for them or not. That there's about an 80% overlap, between those two indices. And that's really important because it means that publics are not as malleable and misdirectable as sometimes governments fear that they would be, and that we can have some faith in the public as being a sound arbiter in the longer run of whether countries are good or not. The differences between the Good Country Index and the Nation Brands Index is differences of nuances. Nobody thinks, wouldn't it be great if China was running the world? In the Nation Brands Index, China is now in the mid-30s. In the Good Country Index, it's in the 60s. Nobody thinks that we should go and ask Mr. Putin how to run the world. They don't think Russia's terrible. Russia's in the mid-20s. So there's a lot of respect for Russia in the world, a lot of respect. And people still want to go to Russia for education. They want to do business with Russia. Sure, they do. But nobody wants Russia to run the world. They want Germany to have a big say. They're interested in France and Britain. That's the way that scientifically measured opinion is going right now. I'm also encouraged that Brexit may have damaged the standing of Britain within Europe, but it hasn't completely wiped out the standing of Britain elsewhere in the world. In fact, I suspect that people always thought that British people were kind of quirky and eccentric, and that Brexit, at some level, people think it was already incorporated within international public ideas about the UK, that they thought, oh, those British people, they're a little bit unpredictable. Maybe they might do something like Brexit. It hasn't destroyed the standing of Britain in the world.
No.
Yeah.
Nicholas, thank you so much for all the sharing that you have made with us this afternoon. We have to continue our program with the sessions for paper givers. In the name of the MARPE network, it was a great pleasure. You are always so provocative and you give us so many lessons for our work and our research on public diplomacy, especially, and today you give us a lot of things to think about, soft power and the concepts, and also about this scientific measure of public opinion. So thank you so much for being with us. I hope you can stay or at least follow some of our sessions. I will give now a 2 minutes break so that we can arrange all the technical aspects and for everyone at home to go grab a coffee or a water. So see you in 2 minutes. Thank you so much, Nicholas.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Pleased to be here with you, particularly in a world of disinformation. I'm pleased to be here with you today to talk about public relations and public diplomacy, and to talk about or discuss some thought-provoking issues in relation to both those fields, particularly in a world of disinformation and disinfodemics, as the World Health Organization refers to it. So we have public relations and public diplomacy, and also some to use the terms corporate or organizational diplomacy. So I'll look at those fields, and what I'll be drawing on is a paper that I wrote some years back on corporate and organizational diplomacy. And also, though, most recently, a book that I published last year called Beyond Post-Communication, which looked at disinformation, deception, and manipulation. So when we look at diplomacy, there's a number of types. And initially, diplomacy was, in its initial form, was conducted by world leaders and diplomats. When you look at some of the world leaders who have been involved in diplomacy, you perhaps understand some of the world's problems. More broadly, public diplomacy, as it's called, also involves non-government organizations, institutions, and increasingly the media operating globally. Then we have also another form of diplomacy called cultural diplomacy, which involves arts organizations and theater and music and cultural organizations around the world cooperating and sharing, which is a third form of diplomacy. And then to that, in recent years, we've seen the operations of large multinational corporations and organizations involved in cross-country communication, and some refer to this as corporate diplomacy or organizational diplomacy. And also, even more broadly, there's what's called civic diplomacy, particularly in the age of social media, where almost anybody in any country is in communication and sharing information and ideas. When we look at the literature on public relations, particularly, and public diplomacy, what we see is quite a few comparisons of public relations and public diplomacy. In particular, they point to the activities of multinational corporations and multinational organizations, which, as I said, is sometimes referred to as corporate and organizational diplomacy. One of the interesting things, though, is that most claims of a similarity are in public relations literature. It's rare to find public diplomacy literature likening itself to public relations. And I'll come back to this point a few times. Jackie Latang has been one of the few academics to critique the claims that public relations and public diplomacy are similar, or that they, and she argues, they have some significant differences. And in my slides, which I'm happy to have shared, I've put the references to most of these claims and the literature. So let's quickly look at what is in common, because certainly there are some things in common. First of all, we see that both public relations and public diplomacy build on the concept of what's called soft power. We're not talking here of military power or even regulatory power, but soft power, the art of persuasion, the use of communication and negotiation. And so both the fields certainly are built around soft power. Both fields also need to recognize and understand the environment in which they operate, the economy, the political system, the culture, etc., of the countries in which they are operating. Public diplomacy and public relations are both undertaken as strategic communication, meaning they do have goals and objectives. So they're different to entertainment and other simpler forms of communication. Both seek to establish and develop relationships. Both see dialogue as a core activity, and they both deal with multiple actors and publics and groups across a wide spectrum of society. What's called the new public diplomacy in particular, in some ways, has moved public diplomacy even closer to public relations, because it's become more and more open beyond diplomats and beyond government leaders. We're seeing more involvement of many non-government and multinational organizations, and also an increasing use of media. A few quotes that talk about this. A veteran public affairs officer in the US says, public diplomacy involves the entire communication spectrum these days, modern communications technology, as well as other methods of intercultural communication and cultural and educational exchange. Joseph Nye, who's one of the primary authors of Soft Power, says that public diplomacy is no longer confined to messaging or promotion campaigns or even direct government contacts with foreign publics and officials. It's also about building relationships with actors in other countries and facilitating networks between non-government parties at home and abroad. Nancy Snow is a very eminent American professor of public diplomacy and propaganda, and she acknowledges there is this level of similarity. She said public diplomacy's roots are in the persuasion industries of PR, marketing, and advertising. And she actually called for recognition of these similarities and mutual interdependencies. But what many people fail to realize and understand is that she was actually quite critical of the similarity. She said that she described PR as the most irresponsible of all the persuasion industries, and that's responsible for the public diplomacy mess we are in. And so many people look at the comparison, but fail to understand that it's often a critical comparison. And so we might look then at why that would be the case. Joseph Nye also warned that skeptics who treat the term public diplomacy as a mere euphemism for propaganda miss the point. And he said straight out, nor is public diplomacy merely public relations. So let's then look at why or how they may be different, public diplomacy on one hand and public relations on the other. And there are some quite significant differences. First of all, public diplomacy still prioritizes interpersonal communication, face-to-face meetings. Even in the age of COVID, of course, that has become more difficult. But across time, public diplomacy is built around meetings and delegations and exchange and cultural events and so forth. Public relations primarily operates through media, both traditional and social media. So they are slightly different in their emphasis on interpersonal versus media. A very important difference is that public diplomacy, all forms of diplomacy, recognize and accept conflict and dissensus. Very often diplomacy has to operate across quite major differences between countries and between cultures, whereas public relations sees conflict as a breakdown, and public relations is always aiming to seek consensus. And if it doesn't achieve consensus, public relations considers that to be a failure. That also leads to another key characteristic of diplomacy and public diplomacy, is that it maintains dialogue at all costs, even in the face of disagreement and conflict. The only exception would be in war, when diplomacy is broken down. So public diplomacy deals with continues dialogue even during conflict and dissensus, so it's agonistic. Whereas public relations engages in dialogue, but in the public relations literature, it says you can withdraw from dialogue or have no deal. It can be an ethical response if the parties don't agree. So public relations is more idealistic, aiming at consensus and relationships, positive relationships in all circumstances. And so because of the approach of public diplomacy, it relies very heavily on negotiation skills. And negotiation is more about give and take, give as well as take. Public relations primarily applies persuasion, and it wants to seek to persuade audiences to the view of the organization or the client. And also public diplomacy usually has built-in mechanisms for dealing with disparities in power. There's methods of arbitration, independent commissions, and public relations is sometimes criticized because the organizations with the biggest budgets have the greatest power, and the largest organizations tend to dominate, and there are no real mechanisms built into public relations for those disparities in power, and marginalized groups that don't have access to budgets and resources tend to be left out of the public relations dialogue. So there are some quite significant differences. Finally, public diplomacy generally has formal protocols for dealing with conflict. There is diplomatic etiquette that applies even during quite heated disputes. Often there's equal sized delegations, but again, public relations has no formal protocols for dealing with conflict. Now, some of those things are critical. So a question that could be asked, well, is this critique of public relations fair? And so what I did in my more recent research is I wrote a book called Beyond Post-Communication, as I mentioned earlier. And this was looking at what are the sources of disinformation and deception and manipulation in our society. And I took a very different approach because I looked at a very large amount of disinformation and manipulation and deception. And whereas most studies point to engage in finger pointing towards Donald Trump or Russian trolls and certain bad actors, I looked at some of the biggest case studies in history, as well as interviewed a number of leaders in communication and media. And just as a few examples that are in the book, this is looking back 60 or 70 years, but one of the major health issues of our age, of course, is the effects of, and there's a typo, a missing C, I'm sorry there, the issue of smoking. And big tobacco emerged in the 1950s with a very, very major campaign when first medical studies came out to show linkage to cancer, lung cancer. The tobacco industry formed the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, and it engaged in intentionally distributing pseudoscience, it could be called. Their theme was fight the science with alternative science. Very similar wording to alternative facts that we heard from a former president of the United States. The issue there was that the American Tobacco Industry Research Committee was formed by a founder of one of the world's largest public relations firms and was serviced by that public relations firm for almost 40 years. Just 40 or so years later, as climate change became an issue, what's referred to as big oil banded together in an organization called the American Petroleum Institute, again formed by a public relations agency, and for the next 3 decades distributed information to undermine the arguments against climate change or for the cause of climate change. And again, public relations played a very significant part. We all recall coming into the 2000s, the war in Iraq that was led by intelligence that claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. But that wasn't the intelligence, that actually was what a report later revealed of the sexing up of the evidence by communication staff in the office of the UK Prime Minister. And so again, it was communication professionals involved in fact, distributing lies. If we come even more recently to 2017, we see one of the leading public relations agencies in the UK. And I mentioned this one because Lord Bell was a former advisor to a British Prime Minister. The firm Bell Pottinger was put out of business, closed down, because it was found to be promoting corrupt regimes in Africa. In 2009, Jeffrey Epstein was sent to prison for sexual offenses. And isn't it interesting that a decade later, he is regarded as famous. He's meeting with prime ministers and royalty. And so I was interested to know how did Jeffrey Epstein build such a reputation after being imprisoned? And of course, he was rearrested in 2019 for the same offenses or similar offenses. What we found is that Jeffrey Epstein engaged a public relations firm, and that public relations firm published a whole series of articles over many years in Forbes magazine, in leading journals, and in some cases they paid journalists to publish the stories. And so here's a case that in my research I found that public relations was implicated in disinformation, and so was journalism. Even our own media is very often not acting ethically. And so these are just many cases. Advertorial's been with us for many, many years, but it's expanded enormously with what is called native advertising, where we make advertising look like it's news information. Paid influencers, turning to the very present time, we have influencers are very, very popular on social media, but a very large number of them are paid. And many of those do not disclose the fact that they paid. And we have a double lack of transparency, because very often they gain their popularity using bots. So they're not really experts, we found. More than half are not experts in their field. And secondly, they are being paid to say the things they say and not disclosing it. And many advertising agencies and PR firms are engaging paid influencers. Consumer reviews, which again is a contemporary thing, and a study in the United States found that 1/3 of all so-called consumer reviews are actually fake. And many of them are written by public relations agencies and public relations departments. So these were just some of the case studies, some of more than 60 case studies that I looked at of where were sources of false information, disinformation coming from. And I also interviewed many leaders in communication, in journalism, in marketing, and in advertising to get their comments. And here's just a few. This was the CEO of one of the large multinational PR agencies in New York. And he said, and he was quite excited about this, to say that in 5 years, consumers won't be able to tell the difference between news and paid messages. Now that, to me and to many journalists, is a tragedy, that if we can't tell advertising from what is news, then it's a very troubling mediascape that we're operating in. The president of the Institute of Public Relations in the US has actually admitted, and she said, I do think PR bears some responsibility for truth decay. Lee Edwards, a colleague at the London School of Economics, gave a very controversial speech recently where she said disinformation is part of the DNA of PR. And she went on to say, I'm not saying that the average PR or communications person is involved in fake news, but she agreed with my research that the biggest companies in public relations, and she named one, have been revealed to be duplicitous in what they have been doing. So what I found in my research, and I'm sharing just a few snapshots from it that I did through 2019 and 2020 that led to the book on post-communication, is even though we point the finger at a few bad actors and say it's Donald Trump or foreign powers, foreign states that are meddling with our media and undermining our democracy, what I found is that public relations, along with advertising and poor journalism, are major contributors to disinformation and our post-truth society. So in that environment, you then have to question, do we want public diplomacy to be conducted in the same way? We see in academic studies and in independent surveys from Gallup and others that public relations has a poor level of public trust and a poor reputation. So again, its lack of credibility, I think, limits its ability to play a meaningful role in public diplomacy. And of course, there's also low trust in business and low trust in government that very often engages public relations as well as advertising. Another final point that I wanted to make that's very important to diplomacy is that Joseph Nye said that public diplomacy, or effective public diplomacy, is a two-way street that involves listening as well as talking. And that was very interesting to me because I also had previously done a study into organizational listening. How do organizations listen? And there are web links in my presentation to all of these, or these two reports on the left and the center that are available freely online. The right-hand side is a book that I wrote on organizational listening. And the essence of that was the organizational listening project involved 3 stages where I interviewed leaders in public relations and communication. I did content analysis of documents such as plans and reports, but I also spent quite a lot of time observing. I worked inside the UK government for 6 months, for example, literally attending meetings and sitting with communication people to see what they do on a daily basis. Altogether, I studied 60 organizations across a number of countries. The bottom line was I found that 80 to 90% of all the resources and time in public relations and corporate communication work is about disseminating organizations' messages, putting out information, and as little as 10% is devoted to listening to stakeholders. Also, when listening is done, it's mainly, almost entirely, to gain intelligence to help the organizations engage in targeting and help them refine their messaging. And so this, to me, is another key difference between public diplomacy and public relations. Now, it doesn't mean to say that both of those fields can work together and that they can learn from each other. But I guess the message that I take out of my research is, first of all, if we look at public relations or corporate and organizational diplomacy, what the research suggests is that, first of all, we need to ensure it is ethical communication. There is a lot of evidence, and we must face up to the fact that a lot of what is done in the field is not ethical. We need to be socially responsible. Organizations need to contribute mutual benefits to the stakeholders in society, not just to the vested interests of their own employers and agencies. We need to implement true two-way communication. Relationships, which is one of the fundamentals of diplomacy and of public relations, requires listening. And I say to anyone listening to this presentation, imagine how you'd have relationships if you don't listen. If you go home and try it even with your own family, If you don't listen, you don't have very good relationships. It's not just about speaking and persuading and propagandizing. And so I think there's need for reform to increase listening within PR and corporate communication. We do need to develop procedures to deal with conflict and dissensus and power inequities. Public relations can't only work for the rich and powerful. It also needs to engage in negotiation, not negation, not trying to stop people doing things, not try to cover things up, but to negotiate. And it needs to broaden beyond the predominant focus on traditional and social media to use a wide range of engagement through culture, education, events, and so forth. I think public diplomacy can also improve and develop with some input from public relations. Public diplomacy does need to have skills in persuasion, not only persuasion, of course, it needs negotiation, but I think public diplomacy can be better at persuasion. They also can refine their media skills. Public relations is very good at media skills, including social media, but new areas like storytelling, visual communication, and so forth. And also public diplomacy is progressively coming into the age of ComTech, as it's called, but to adopt an expanding range of communications technology. And so I've offered these thought-provoking comments to suggest to people that we need to resist a simple glossing over to say that public relations is the same thing as public diplomacy, or to assume that public diplomacy can simply use public relations techniques. Both fields can improve, both fields need to improve to have true two-way communication. My final message is that it is interesting to me that today in our world of technology, we can listen to the universe, but we often don't listen to each other. And both public relations and diplomacy requires us to listen to each other across cultures, across countries, around the world. Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
So, thank you, Professor, for this excellent and pertinent reflection. Professor Macnamara is here with us. So now I open a space for Q&A. So does anyone want to ask a question, please? You can raise your hand. Lucille?
Yeah,
please.
thank you very much. My question is about the word strategic. When you described public diplomacy as a strategic communication, and very quickly you said something that has goals, not only entertainment, for instance. And for me, that requires some further explanation, because it's not only a negative, it's what it's not entertainment. So how can you better describe strategic goals and better describe this very problematic adjective, because all communication are supposedly strategic, I guess. Thank you for your conference anyway.
Thank you, Lucille. It's a good question. There is a lot of literature on strategic communication, and strategic in its very basic sense means that it does have goals and objectives, as opposed to we often just communicate socially for no particular objective, free-flowing discussion, entertainment, and so forth. The literature does point out, I think the nut of your question is that there's an old-fashioned view of strategic that came out of management literature in the 1970s, that strategic was about achieving the objectives of the organization, without going into great detail about a big shift in literature. But that has changed over recent years. And even people like Henry Mintzberg, who's a management consultant and academic who wrote about strategic communication as all about the organization, has really completely changed his view. And he now says that to be truly strategic and think long term, you need to achieve the organization's goals and the goals of the stakeholders. and they talk about issues like emergent strategy. So emergent strategy and emergent strategic communication is in the literature. Not all organizations practice this, of course, although there is some signs of it. Movements like social purpose and corporate social responsibility, if it's done meaningfully, it often isn't done meaningfully, but issues like social purpose, that organizations take on an approach that an organization must achieve its own objectives, but contemporary versions of strategic communication say that you also need to think long-term, and to survive long-term, you need to also allow your stakeholders to achieve their objectives. So it's the win-win approach. And that's a very quick summary of sort of latest thinking on strategic communication. There is a lot of argument about strategic communication and how far you can go, because an organization can never give up on its own goals. But if you don't allow stakeholders to achieve their goals and to flourish in society, that organization may not be sustainable long term.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Zhao, you want to ask your question, please?
I think before me, there are one question of Camellia, maybe.
Sorry?
I
You can
think
put your question.
one here has already raised a hand. No? If so, I will take my. Okay. Okay, I just want to ask a question about some, some boundaries between the PD and PR. You just separated the practice of public diplomacy and public relations, but it seems that we need to consider a new fact, that is, with the rapid popularization of social media, we have seen the intersection and mixing of public diplomacy and public relations practice. Which makes the boundary between these two disciplines and practices increasingly blurred. For example, the PD you mentioned just now relies on basically on people-to-people communication and exchanges, but we now see more public diplomacy practices that depend on a mediated form, such as the term mediated public diplomacy defended by Gay Collen. It seems like a PR approach. In addition, some PR practices are changing traditional public diplomacy practice. So there's my question is it still necessary to make a strict distinction between PD and PR practices, or should we pay more attention to the perspective of organizational communication? For example, through the use of constructivism approach to combine with some discursive analysis to understand the power relationship and to understand the complexity represented by the practice of public diplomacy communication at this time. Thank you for your.
I think there's two issues that are mixed here. With social media, of course, it's open and public, and so public relations is occurring in social media. Civic diplomacy, which is probably the better term for when ordinary citizens are posting. To me, the issue is about authenticity, because when we talk about practices, we talk about the professional field and what it aims to do. Now, the professional field of public diplomacy is defined, it has objectives, and they are built around negotiation, built around maintaining relationships, even through dissensus. Public relations has a different set of objectives. And what I'm talking about is that public relations, particularly the way it's practiced in the North American model, is very much about achieving the objectives of an organization, full stop. Now, that is not public diplomacy. Public diplomacy has to look at achieving the objectives of a broader range of stakeholders in society. If you take a broader view of public relations, and I accept that there are scholars and practitioners who do, but I'm talking about the majority, and the majority of public relations works for organizations. The majority of public relations, the fact is that 90% of public relations professional practice is employed by large governments and large multinational corporations. And it is practiced to achieve the goals of those organizations. And sometimes those objectives are in conflict with the interests of society. And so there are fundamental differences. Both in a free world are able to operate, but to me, the issue is authenticity. Things like paid influencers, things like merged media, these are disguised forms. They are not ethical forms of communication. If we look at the activities of Cambridge Analytica or Bell Pottinger, I'm calling those out to say that they are not transparent, they're not authentic, they're not in the interests of society. And so I'm not saying that public relations and public diplomacy, they overlap, they can complement each other, but I am critical of the way some public relations is practiced, because there's a tendency to say, oh, public diplomacy is simply public relations. If public diplomacy becomes public relations the way it is practiced around the world, I think we're in a lot of trouble.
Thank you, Professor. Camelia, do you want to ask a question? No?
A lot of trouble, you mean democracies are in a lot of trouble?
Yes, because in my book, I set out really looking, in my 2020 book, I was really interested in this idea of disinformation and deception and manipulation, because we had Cambridge Analytica, we had the dreadful Trump era and allegedly Russian trolls and so forth. And the issue there was we were finger pointing. And when I talked to leaders in communication, they usually said, oh yes, there are a few bad apples, was the other argument used. There's a few bad apples, but by and large, everything we do is okay. When I looked at the evidence, and I spent 2 years looking at public communication campaigns, what I found is the biggest perpetrators of disinformation was marketing and advertising and public relations, by far. And yet we just never talk about it. And so I guess that's the bottom line that drives me, is that these are important practices. We do need them in our economies and our society, but I think they need to reform, and they need to address and not simply say it's a few bad apples. Because if we allow that to continue and we allow that amount of disinformation, it is destructive to democracy. It is destructive to marginalized groups, because where does public relations and advertising and marketing funded, and who does it serve? It serves a very small economic elites and political power elites of our society, because the average person and small community groups and marginalized groups cannot afford to pay public relations, but they are entitled to public diplomacy. And that's where I draw a different line, is that public diplomacy should speak for society, all sectors of society. So I'm not separating the fields entirely, but I'm resisting the urge to simply blend them and say public diplomacy should become like public relations. If it does, we will only have the voice of the powerful and the elites and the propagandists.
Thank you, Professor. Any more questions?
I hope that's not too
Susanna?
controversial.
Yeah.
Yes.
Susanna, please.
Thank you very much, Jim Macnamara. Well, my question is, you brought us the dark side of a profession, and we as the PR community, what it will be our role, what can we do about this?
Yes.
Well, it is our field. So what do you think that the PR community can do in order to, well, not have this? We know that we will not be able, all the professions, all the fields have a dark side, but to improve a more ethical role.
Yeah, thank you, Susanna. It's a very good question. And so I know I'm being controversial in bringing out these points, but I do believe that there is much we can do. And what I'm advocating is that ethical public relations practitioners do stand up and take an active voice in their organizations around the world. I don't think the public relations organizations are doing enough, because very often they're defending and saying everything is okay. And I'm not trying to be destructive. I'm saying we cannot gloss this over. which we have been doing for a long time. And I've worked in public relations. I've been president of a national public relations institute. So I'm not the enemy of the field, but I just think it is important that, and when we look at public diplomacy, what I do see is a tendency to reach out and grab public diplomacy as a blanket of respectability, that we are like public diplomacy. I'm simply saying we've got to clean up our own act. And we need to do that with better ethical standards and better education and better training around the world, because it isn't just a few bad apples. And why does public relations have the reputation it does? We always say it's because the public misunderstands. Well, it's probably because a lot of our colleagues do behave in very unethical ways. Now, it's a very difficult challenge how to do it. The Chartered Institute of Public Relations in the UK obtained a royal charter so they could potentially bar practitioners who are unethical. But just as an example of that, what I found disturbing is that when you probably know of the CPIR, it's one of the only institutes in the world that has a royal charter, in other words, legislation. Because if most institutes call out bad behavior, you can be sued for defamation. They have the royal charter, they have the legislation, but you have to be chartered. So the CIPR has 10,000 members. I interviewed a number of former presidents, and what I found out, and I was shocked, how many of their members, of their 10,000 members, have actually done the chartered exam. The answer is 300, 3%. Only 3% have gone to become chartered. Now imagine if that's how the legal profession worked, or the accountancy profession worked, where you have to be chartered, you have to be registered. And so that's just one example where we can do a lot more. If we really, and we talk about wanting to be a profession, then I think we've got a way to go to become a profession. And we can't just grab something like public diplomacy and say, oh, we are diplomats, or we are all doing a very good job. So I don't mean to be destructive. My intent is to call out evidence to say we have to stop glossing over and giving normative theories of public relations, when in fact the practice is often not performed very well.
Thank you, Professor. We have another question from Haluka.
Yes, hi, hello. Thank you very much, Professor Macnamara, for your talk and presentation. It was extremely engaging and not at all destructive or disruptive. What I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned marginal voices, you mentioned marginal publics, and also you mentioned the fact that pretty much your considerations and reflections based on a North American model of public relations. Now, my question would be, how can we understand, just building on Zhao's question, how can we understand, let's say, different types of configurations and histories of public relations in different spaces? In UK, it has more of a, public relations has always been more public interest rooted in the way that it has also configured. And how can we understand, let's say, the intersections and interactions with social movements and organic social movements that have arisen in the last years? And because you mentioned as a major difference between public diplomacy and public relations, dissensus and consensus, and these social movements, they emerge from and they are driven by social categories who are vulnerable, who are marginal, and who live in a sort of dissensus or conflictual state, right? So they try and they use civic diplomacy, they use public relations for building legitimacy in the society. So where would you position, let's say, or where would you place this kind of different traditions, let's say, and different social traditions? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Luca. One of the challenges in discussing public relations is very much the fact that there are different models, but also there's a move around the world. And I must confess, I've not worked in South America, but I've worked in Europe, I've worked in Asia, and I've worked in North America and the UK. When I referred to the North American model, it was really because it is the dominant model worldwide, the whole excellence theory and four models. And even in Asia, to me, it's somewhat disappointing that they teach the American model of public relations, which is very much about neoliberal capitalism. And in fact, we are seeing the emergence of more locally, culturally orientated models of public relations. And in those, I must admit, I see great promise. And certainly in the activist field and in community organizations, they are using the practices of public relations. Generally, they don't call it public relations. So now we have corporate communication, organizational communication, strategic communication, and many other names. And even that is a reflection of the problem that people are moving away from the terminology because it is mostly associated with neoliberal capitalist models. And I was just picking up a book. In fact, I picked up an American book today to read from my friend Mark Wiener in the US. And I love Mark, he's a great guy, but all through it, it just talks about the objectives of the business. It doesn't mention other types of organization. It just talks about the business, achieving the goals of the business. And that to me is a very narrow concept of public relations. If you are defining, call it whatever you will, community relations, public relations in a different cultural model, then I think there is great hope. The problem we have is that the neoliberal capitalist model has really dominated, and it's almost become the just textbooks of courses around the world. And I do see in Europe, for example, a declining use of the term public relations, and they talk about corporate communication or strategic communication because they want to step away from that capitalist model.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Are there any questions? No? So I thank you all. Professor, it was a pleasure to hear you, and it was a huge pleasure to learn from you. So thank you so much. Now we'll take a short break. We'll be back.
Thank you all.
Thank you. We'll be back in 5 minutes to the third session of the conference. So